All right, we're gonna give it just 1 or 2 more minutes and then we'll get started. All right, we'll go and get started. If everyone's ready, I'm ready. And then also for notes, I am recording this so we can upload it onto YouTube later. Um, and if you have questions, you can comment them in the chat, and Spiv will direct my attention to them. You can also raise your hand. I will not be, I, I'm screen sharing, so I won't be able to peek at the chat unless someone makes me aware of it. So please feel free to do that. Okay, so this is military tactics for the Amtgard battlefield. We're going to go over some terminology, some field placement, and strategic maneuvers and principles. That way you can get more acquainted with how to apply those general ideas to battle gaming in Amtgard. Um, so a lot of times you hear these words thrown around and no one bothers to explain them to you. It's just assumed that you know what they mean. And I'm sure a lot of these are common sense, but it's important that we make sure that we're discussing things with the same denotations and connotations in mind. So let's go over some general terminology. The goal is the win condition. That is how you win battle games. The objective are actions taken to accomplish the goal. Um, for instance, if you're playing King of the Hill, the goal is to hold the hill the longest, and the objective might be, um, set up a spawn point alternative on the hill, or um, make sure that you're holding your front so that the hill doesn't collapse. That sort of thing would be an objective. Oh, let me make sure that I have it on. I'm sorry. Okay, sorry about that, guys. I apparently accidentally joined on my phone because I thought I could have it up to check the chat, but I cannot. So, uh, sorry about that. Let me go ahead and turn back on screen sharing. Can everyone see my screen now? Okay, awesome. And I have opened up the chat so I can see it on my phone. I just fat fingered joining. I apologize for that, guys. Let's start over. Okay, so general terminology is the win condition. That's the goal. So that's how you win the game. The objective or actions taken to accomplish the goal. And an offense is an aggressive operation or an attack. Defense is a protective operation. And a decisive point is a crucial geographical location or event that, when acted upon, gives significant advantage. I know that sounds kind of vague in this moment, but we'll break that down further later. And the fog of war is chaos that happens during battle. That's chance, friction, confusion. That is the fog of war. And then there's also battlefield terminology, and these are specific terms that allow you to better denote locations on a field. So the front line is the military line formed by the most forward advanced military units. Um, the midline is the area formed between the front line and the back line. And the back line is the support or strategic positions away from direct engagement. Um, and instances of where you kind of want to live in these positions are frontline is typically for your big beefy armored boys. Your midline is going to be support that's going to dance back and forth between the front line and the midline. That's your pocket healers, your support bards, that sort of thing. And then your back line is going to be your archers, your uh, res bots, that sort of thing. Field application. So applying these three terms allows you to break down the area into loose thirds. It would look something like this. You have your allied side and your enemy side, and the red would be your front line, the yellow would be your midline, and the green would be your back line. You can also break it down into different thirds. There's the flank, which is the left or right side of a military formation. And there's the center or the front, which is the middle or interior side of a military formation. Um, and in field application, it looks something like this. So your center would be the blue part, and your flanks would be the purple parts. Um, and then you can also combine these to be very specific and precise with your callouts. And they can serve as locations or objectives when planning strategies. For instance, take out the resbot in their left back line, or we need reinforcements to our right flank. And when you overlap them all, it kind of looks like this, and you can call out like specific areas of the field very quickly and very precisely using these terminologies. For instance, um, and so you can take these general terms and general placements and get really conceptual with them, and that's what we call strategy. And we're going to be going over the fundamentals of strategy, specifically the Principles of War by Karl von Clausewitz. Um, this is that guy. He was a famous uh, general in the Prussian army. And he proposes that strategy should cover the following: defense, offense, use of troops, use of terrain, and decisive points. And look at him, isn't he adorable? Um, and decisive points are historically things like capturing railways, ports, cover, or even illness or ration loss. Um, in Amtgard, these are terrain, resources, fortifications, or vantages. For instance, on the pictured field, certain positions could change the tide of battle, and capturing them as objectives could be a decisive point. So if you're able to hold the bottleneck here, that could be a decisive point. If you're able to flank the bottleneck in some way, that could be a decisive point. Um, so again, these are things that change the tide of battle. And then he has some fundamentals of strategy, and these are called strategic principles. The first one is concentric or decisive superiority. And this basically just means having superior numbers or firepower. Envelopment or encirclement. This is strategically outmaneuvering your opponent to cut off their retreat, to take them by surprise, that sort of thing. Which brings us to our next point, which is surprise and security. These are two sides of the same coin. Surprise, you really want that when you're making offensive things, taking the enemies by surprise because it limits their reaction time. And then security is the opposite. When you're thinking defensively, you really want to be secure in your positions. Think like, oh, I know I can't be flanked here because there's a wall behind me, for instance. And then conquer and destroy. Um, this is about controlling parts of the field, controlling resources, and limiting the ability of your enemy to do those things. And then possession. This is about, again, possessing those resources, maintaining possession of those resources or field positions. Um, and then combining these fundamental principles of strategy brings us to different military maneuvers. So first, we're going to go over some offensive strategies. The first one and the most basic is the frontal assault. And this is attacking or aggressing on the opponent directly. It typically works only if the aggressing force has superiority over the defending force in some way. And it is historically seen in like Greek phalanx formations. Um, However, this can be costly as it brings the assault to bear against the entirety of the defending force, even if it is successful. And then it uses the principles of concentric force and conquer and destroy. And here's an example of what a frontal assault might look like. It is a front line going against another front line and smashing against each other. And then the group with the superior forces wins. So there's also the flanking maneuver. This is movement and attack around the flank of an opponent's forces. Um, it works using basic strategic principles of envelopment, surprise, and concentric force. And here is what a flank maneuver might look like. Um, So you can see, again, you want to take like a hypermobile force and just kind of run against the side of your opponent here, flanking them, cutting off their movement, that sort of thing. Flanking has been a consistent part of warfare basically as long as war has existed and is the most fundamental battlefield strategy. Defensive counters include using terrain or fortification to anchor or pin the attacking flank, such as the Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae. And successful flanking maneuvers require sufficient force and/or mobility to overwhelm the opposing flank. In Amtgard, this mobility can come from physicality, think fast players, or magic, like Blink, Teleport, Song of Freedom, that sort of thing. And in Amtgard, sufficient force can come from heavy militia or firepower and support from mages to break the enemy flank. When thinking about flanking, the most common example is flanking on the ditch field, and that's tends to be why your more heavy hitters either gravitate towards the outside to pin the flanks and to stop flanking maneuvers, or to perform the flanking maneuvers themselves. Um, There's also the pincer maneuver. This is a special type of flanking maneuver, and it's movement and attack around the flank of an opponent's forces on both sides of the field. It works using the same strategic principles as flanking, that's envelopment, surprise, and concentric force. And it would look something like this. You can see why it's called a pincer maneuver. There are a lot of other names for it, a horn maneuver, a U maneuver, that sort of thing. I just went over that. It's also called a double envelopment crescent formation. There's a lot of names for this. It's been used throughout history in a variety of ways. Sun Tzu specifically writes about this maneuver in The Art of War, suggesting to avoid a full envelopment as to allow for enemy surrender. He posits that if you don't give your enemy an escape route, they will become more unpredictable and therefore harder to beat. And they fight more ferociously. Historical examples include the Battle of Marathon by the Athenians, the Blitzkriegs of Nazi Germany, and Genghis Khan's cavalry attacks. It requires the same strategic principles as a flanking maneuver, but relies heavily on increased mobility. And then we have an even more special flanking maneuver. This combines a flanking maneuver with a frontal assault, creating a hammer and anvil type of situation. It is movement and attack around the flank of an opponent's forces, pinning them against a frontal assault. It works using the basic strategic principles of envelopment, surprise, and concentric force. And it would look something like this. Um, So you have your two hammers that will flank out and then pin the enemies against your anvil. Um, it was famously used by Alexander the Great, Hannibal, Suleiman the Magnificent. Defense includes reinforcing the flanks to pin the hammers without allowing the anvil to overwhelm the front. The flanking hammer is typically a hypermobile unit, while the anvil plays a slower or more static role. Um, and it may be used with either the pincer or the flanking maneuver, depending on the terrain. Basically, you can have one hammer, you can have two hammers, um, whatever works best in the situation. And again, this utilizes the same strategic principles as the flanking maneuver, but also the frontal assault, which includes conquer and destroy. Uh, there's also shock and awe. This is a special kind of frontal assault, and it's a full frontal assault with overwhelming military force. It works using basic strategic principles of surprise, and conquer and destroy, and decisive power. It would look something like this. That's not a maple leaf on the Canadian flag. That's explosions. So, shock and awe is about um, extreme rapidness and overwhelming force, and this can be done with physical force, such as extreme aggression, or other types of force like magic, destruction arrows, that sort of thing. This doctrine was authored um, by Ullman and Wade, and historical examples include Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In Amtgard, this would be verbal kill spells or rapid crowd control spells. Think about how hard it is to react if everyone on the enemy team was using all of their abilities, their kill spells, just running at you as hard and as fast as they can, all at once in a unified force. That's what Shokunon means. Oh, and it works using the strategic principles of surprise, concentric force, and destroy and conquer. There's also the siege. This is blocking a military force from supplies or reinforcements when it cannot be taken by a quick assault. It works using the strategic principles of encirclement and possession. And historical examples include the Trojan War and every castle battle ever. And it would look something like this. So there are sub-strategies for the siege. One of those is bombardment, and that is launching projectiles at the fortifications or the defenders. And bombardment in Amtgard can involve range or thrown weapons, spell balls, spells, or siege weaponry to weaken the defenders or their fortifications. A breach is the collapsing or penetration of fortification to launch an assault against the defenders. That would be breaking through the walls, teleporting over the walls, that sort of thing. Um, and again, that breach can be accomplished by physical or magical means in Amtgard. There's also bait and bleed. This is a cautious assault where the aggressor moves as a unit, making tactical feints or taunts to lure the enemy out of position or stutter the enemy's position with cautious attacks to whittle away at the enemy team. Um, It was used heavily in World War I and was also called bloodletting, and it can be used in tandem with magic, ranged weapons, or polearms to maximize the effect. I'm sure on the field, especially on ditch fields, you've heard of bait and bleed, which is where, you have your polearms taking those leg shots, weakening your opponent. That way you can build up that um, concentric power to overwhelm the enemy forces. And it's best utilized in tight areas like the beginning of a bridge battle to establish a number advantage or in shatter battles where a cautious approach is preferred. And then again, you do often see this early in ditch rounds, followed by flanking maneuvers once you have established that dominance. Um, there's also decapitation. This is a strategic assault to destroy the center of command and sow disorder on the enemy team. In Amtgard, this is prioritizing high impact targets, usually sword knights or battle masters, but this can also be suppressing, killing, or otherwise removing enemy support structures, such as healers, bards, and druids. And this can be accomplished through other strategic maneuvers, ranged attacks or spells, or even psychologically. And it would look something like this. So it's picking those high priority targets and removing them from the field by whatever means you have available to you. Um, there's also divide and conquer. This is attacking an enemy force section by section with the majority of your own force rather than all at once. This works using the principles of concentric force, envelopment, and conquer and destroy. It was famously used by Gallic tribes against Julius Caesar's army, and requires distributing, supporting enemy units or striking fast enough that they cannot respond. This can be ranged, magical, or otherwise. Think of this as dissecting the field section by section and destroying those groups. That way, they have less resources, less enemies that they can respond with. And you want to do this rapidly. That way, they cannot respond quickly and bring their forces to bear against yours. And again, this is best used in tandem with other strategies. That brings us to defensive strategies. There's, of course, anchoring a flank. This is concentrating the defensive force on the front line to prevent the enemy from aggressing, particularly in the flanks of the formation. Historical examples include the Battle of Marathon, which is where the Athenians placed more skillful soldiers um, and a higher number of soldiers on the flanks. That's actually where we get the word echelon for, because, if you're an upper echelon, you are on the flanks, meaning you are a more skilled soldier. The more visible example in Amtgard is placing the more mobile or skilled players on the ends of a ditch line to pin the anchor um, or prevent attempted flank maneuvers. It utilizes the principles of concentric superiority, security, and possession. There's the choke point, and this is using a geographical feature to narrow the front and decrease the combat effectiveness of the aggressor, making it harder to bring superior numbers to bear. Historical examples include the defense of Leonidas at the Pass of Thermopylae or William Wallace's victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. If the choke point is on both flanks, it is called a bottleneck, and it works by using decisive superiority, security, and possession. And it would look something like this. So it's a way that you can limit the forces of the enemy by determining how quickly they can aggress on you um, geographically. There's also defense in depth. This is yielding ground to an attacking enemy force to allow them to lose momentum, spread too thin, take casualties, or lose resources. It is effectively a tactical withdrawal. Once the effectiveness of the enemy push has waned, the defense would typically launch a counterstrike mounted against the derived weak points. As the enemy continues the advance, they become more susceptible to flanks and risk becoming enveloped. Um, it works using the principles of security, encirclement, and concentric superiority. So it's basically allowing your enemy to overextend and then capitalizing on that overextension. There's also turtling. This is minimizing risk while accumulating reinforcements, resources, or waiting for a tactical time to strike. It can be used in solo fights as well as large-scale battle games, and is a common tactic in fighting games and real-time strategy games like StarCraft. To make turtling effective, forces need to derive an advantage from playing cautiously or punish the enemy from overextending. This works using the principles of securities, concentric superiority, and possession. A great example of when to turtle would be buying time so that your team wave respawns in, um, or you've gotten that point on King of the Hill, and now you're trying to like wind down the clock so you can score more points. Those would be examples of when to turtle. And that brings us to psychological strategies. And I think these are the most fun because you can really pop your other strategies up by adding psychology to them. Um, First is the feint. This is pretending to take an action to evoke a reaction from the enemy and then doing something else. It can be used in solo fighting or large-scale strategy, and it requires using in tandem with other strategies and committing enough to make the feint believable. It works using the principle of surprise. So, for instance, a feint on the field would be, pretending to flank on one side and then rapidly and immediately shifting to flank on the other side, that sort of thing. And it takes the enemy by surprise, limiting their reaction time, and that's how you derive the advantage. There's also moral ascendancy. This is the influence a group or person has over the other through perceived character and authority. Um, I am the better army. I dominate you by morale, training, and capability. That's a line from The Line of Control. You lose every fight you don't believe you can win, and you can control the mental narrative of the opponent through confidence, appearance, and disposition. How many times have you heard, well, he lost the fight before he even stepped on the field? If you can crush the spirit of your enemy before they even line up to fight you, just by being big and threatening and taking up that space psychologically, you can derive advantage from that. And of course, it uses the principle of decisive superiority. Then there's the razzle dazzle. Dazzle camouflage was originally referred to as geometric patterns on warships to make distance and heading difficult to determine. Modern razzle-dazzle tactics use rapid, unpredictable movements, feints, direction changes, and tempo shifts to make it hard for the enemy to predict. Um, Razzle-dazzle can also refer to sensory overloading the opponent with noise, visuals, and the unexpected. Um, Basically, it's dazing and confusing your opponent and then capitalizing on that chaos on the fog of war. It utilizes the principle of surprise, and it's all about constant novelty and disruption. So that's rapid field position changes, uh, rapid spell casting, that sort of thing. That way, the enemy cannot react, and you can derive advantage from that. There's mutually assured destruction, and this is using the threat of strong weaponry or force to prevent the enemy from utilizing those same weapons. Historically, this is a reference to the use of nuclear weaponry and how neither side would survive, so neither side escalates. In Amtgard, you can often hold an opening or stall an enemy simply by standing at the right place and looking like you are an equal or greater threat. Um, and then, of course, if you can't beat them, join them in hell. So, for instance, I don't know how many times you've seen someone holding a corridor or a bridge just by threatening with an ice ball or a pole arm. It's using that to your advantage. And then application. Um, so there are limitless ways to combine all of the aforementioned strategies depending on field conditions and team composition. You need to assess your terrain, troops, and goal to tailor your strategy to the conditions of the battlefield that you are on. And you need to have multiple plans in case conditions change on the field. Experience and practice will enable you to make better plans and to adjust these strategies on the fly. So don't be discouraged if your first strategy does not succeed. And that brings us to questions. Do we have any questions, guys? Yeah, I see some conversation about video game strategy as well. So StarCraft is a really good way to build like strategic principles in the mind. Also Fortnite, like I specifically mentioned Razzle Dazzle. That is a military strategy that's been widely adopted by Fortnite. Um, thank you, Stoked. Sid asks, when applying mutually assured destruction as a concept, are you referring to doing things like threatening casts on vulnerable high-value targets, or is it more goading someone to taking a bad trade, assuming both of you die, but your team gets more out of it? Um, Either I typically threaten high-value targets with mutually assured destruction, or high value field positions. Um, the other thing that you can do is kind of like threaten a flank and taunt from behind. Um, that way, they have to take that threat seriously, even if you're just one guy from your team, um, because no one wants to get backstabbed. I feel like that's a principle that's heavily used by a lot of assassins. And so it's either, you know, you might kill me, but I might kill you, and that threaten takes their attention off of the front lines enough for your team to derive advantage. A good way to learn field strategy and tactics and how to look at the field. Um, Honestly, the way that I started looking at the field was by playing jugging and jugger. It's so fast paced and involves like position and field strategy, but takes magic out of the equation, which allows you to kind of dumb the games down enough to think about them as far as like reading a field and strategy, but it still requires a lot of strategic principles, especially because it has pinning and flanking and all of these other things. And then once you learn how to read the field, um, without magic, you can start applying magic to that as well. And then it really, I don't want to say complicates, but makes your strategies that much juicier, gives you something to dig into. Yeah, Sid echoes that jugging is amazing at teaching maneuvers and tactics. Um, but yeah, any field will do, and you don't have to strip magic out of it. I just think it's easier to simplify and then build off of that. Um, You can also rewatch battle videos. I find that that really helps me. Um, Having like a watch party with my friends and going over what happened in that moment. What are the ways that you could have reacted to that differently? How do you think things will play out versus how they actually play out? And so it's kind of like honing that strategic blade. The other thing I like to do is a lot of times battle games will get posted in advance. And so like for Bridge Wars, for instance, like we all got in on a call and I drew the field and then we would just like a whiteboard go over strategies, like football plays basically, for the different game types and mechanics and team layouts. That way we could plan things in advance and it really helps kind of like cover all of your blind spots because not everyone is going to know every strategy or think about every possible foreseeable outcome. And so when you're looking at it as a team and workshopping these things in advance, it helps make you more well-rounded. Yeah, Sid mentions in chat that you can see your macro goal and then break that down into micro goals. That's what we mean by goal and um, objective. So your goal is your macro, your objective is your micro, the steps you need to take to get to that long-term goal. All right. If there are no other questions, we can go ahead and end the lecture. But if you think of something, or if you just want to talk about strategy or tactics, or improving yourself or your team, my DMs are always open. So feel free to message.